Before the age of machines or satellites, before the globe was a familiar shape on classroom walls, there was mystery. The world was vast and half-imagined, its oceans filled with rumor, its lands separated by myth. In medieval maps, dragons guarded the unknown, and margins read, "Here be monsters." Yet beyond those imagined beasts lay something far greater. A real planet, waiting to be revealed. It was not only the Earth that would be discovered, but humanity itself, scattered, unaware, soon to collide in currents of conquest, trade, and transformation. The age of discovery began not with a single voyage, but with hunger. A hunger for spice, for gold, for knowledge, and for salvation. In the 15th century, Europe stirred after centuries of isolation. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 severed the overland routes to Asia, and suddenly the known world shrank. The Silk Roads that once carried cinnamon and silk from the east were blocked by the rising power of the Ottoman Empire. What had once been a network of trade became a wall. To reach the treasures of India and Cathay, one would now have to go around the world or perish trying. On the Iberian Peninsula, kingdoms born from centuries of war against Muslim rule, Portugal and Castile, turned their gaze outward. They were small, fierce nations perched at the edge of the Atlantic, their sailors hardened by wind and salt. To the west lay an endless ocean, to the south the scorching coast of Africa. And beyond, rumor spoke of kingdoms of gold. The Portuguese, under Prince Henry the Navigator, began inching southward, mapping the coastline of West Africa, one promontory at a time. In 1420, Durfidin and Forn. 2014, they captured Ceuta, the gateway to North Africa, and in doing so, opened the door to Africa's riches. Henry gathered cartographers, astronomers, and shipwrights in his school at Sagres, a beacon of knowledge at the edge of the known world. There, the caravel was born, a light, swift ship with lateen sails that could tack against the wind, unlike the heavy cogs of medieval Europe. It was this elegant vessel that would carry humanity into the unknown. Bar of 514.48, Bartolomeo Diaz rounded the storm-lashed tip of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope, proving that the ocean to the east could indeed be reached by sea. His crew saw the Indian Ocean stretching before them, its winds different, its promise immense. Diaz turned back, battered and weary, but his voyage had shattered the limits of Europe's geography. 10 years later, Vasco da Gama would complete the dream. Sailing from Lisbon in 1497, he braved uncharted waters, disease, and mutiny until he reached Calicut on India's Malabar coast. The sea route to the east was real. Spices, pepper, cloves, cinnamon, once worth their weight in gold, could now be brought directly by ship. Portugal, a nation of fewer than 2 million, had opened the veins of global trade. But while Portugal sailed east, another man dreamed of sailing west. Christopher Columbus, a Genoese mariner steeped in the writings of Marco Polo and Ptolemy, believed the world was round and smaller than it truly was. He sought to reach Asia by crossing the Atlantic. For years he was dismissed, his plans ridiculed, until at last the crowns of Castile and Aragon, newly united under Ferdinand and Isabella, agreed to fund him. In August 1492, 3 small ships, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, set sail from Palos de la Frontera. Behind them lay Europe's old certainties. Ahead, an ocean no one had yet crossed. For 33 days, the horizon was unbroken. Sailors whispered mutiny. Then, in the early hours of October 12th, a cry rang out. Tierra! Land! They had reached what they believed was Asia, but it was not. Columbus had touched the Bahamas, and, unknowingly, the edge of a new world. The encounter that followed would forever change history. The Americas, continents isolated for millennia, were suddenly thrust into contact with the Old World. Crops, animals, diseases, and ideas began to cross the Atlantic in both directions in what historians now call the Columbian Exchange. Maize, potatoes, and tomatoes transformed diets in Europe and Asia. Horses, cattle, and wheat reshaped the landscapes of the Americas. But along with them came invisible invaders, smallpox, measles, influenza, that decimated indigenous populations by the tens of millions. The Age of Discovery was not merely a story of exploration, but of collision, of civilizations meeting, merging, and often annihilating one another. Portugal, not to be outdone, pressed eastward into the Indian Ocean, building forts at Goa, Malacca, and Hormuz. The Treaty of Tordesillas, signed in 1494 under the gaze of the Pope, divided the non-European world in two, an invisible line running down the Atlantic. Lands to the west would belong to Spain, those to the east to Portugal. On a map, it seemed simple. In reality, it would shape centuries of empire, faith, and blood. In the decades that followed, the sea became the stage of human ambition. Ferdinand Magellan, a Portuguese captain sailing for Spain, sought to find a western route to the Indies. In 1519, he set out with 5 ships from Seville, crossing the Atlantic, skirting the coast of South America, and finally discovering the strait that bears his name, the Strait of Magellan. Beyond it lay an ocean so vast, so eerily calm, that he named it Mare Pacificum, the Pacific Ocean. The voyage was a trial of endurance. Months passed without sight of land. Men starved, their gums rotted from scurvy, and the sea itself seemed infinite. Magellan would not live to see the end. He was killed in the Philippines in 1521 on the shores of Mactan. But one of his ships, the Victoria, under Juan Sebastian Elcano, completed the circumnavigation of the globe in 1522. For the first time in history, humanity had physically proved the Earth's roundness, not by theory, but by voyage. The world was now one continuous sphere of discovery and exchange. As the 16th century dawned, new powers rose to seize the winds of fortune. Spain, enriched by the silver of Potosi and Zacatecas, forged an empire stretching from Mexico to the Philippines. The Atlantic world was transformed. Fleets carried bullion eastward and enslaved Africans westward, binding continents in a brutal new economy. In Seville, the Casa de Contratación tracked every galleon and every coin, turning the oceans into ledgers of imperial wealth. Meanwhile, England, France, and the Netherlands, once peripheral kingdoms, began to challenge Iberian dominance. The English sent John Cabot to the coasts of Newfoundland in 1497, staking a quiet claim to lands that would centuries later birth new nations. The French, led by Jacques Cartier, sailed up the St. Lawrence River, glimpsing the vastness of North America's interior. The Dutch, pragmatic and mercantile, turned to the Spice Islands, building the Dutch East India Company, a corporation powerful enough to wage war and govern colonies. The discovery of the world was becoming an industry. Maps multiplied. In European cities, printing presses spread atlases that redrew humanity's imagination. No longer flat or symbolic, these maps pulsed with geography. Coasts, rivers, and islands sketched with growing precision. The world was being measured, commodified, and understood in ways that made distance itself seem conquerable. Yet discovery was not one-sided. Across the oceans, other civilizations watched and adapted. In the Mughal courts of India, Portuguese envoys were received with curiosity. In Japan, Jesuit missionaries brought Western science, astronomy, and faith, blending them with native traditions. In China, Matteo Ricci translated European maps and clocks, introducing new conceptions of a globe that was no longer bound by heaven alone. The meeting of worlds was not merely conquest. It was also conversation. one that reshaped art, language, and thought. But beneath the sails of progress flowed darker tides. The transatlantic slave trade, born in the shadow of exploration, would carry over 12 million Africans into bondage between the 15th and 19th centuries. Sugar, tobacco, and cotton, the crops that fueled Europe's prosperity, were watered with human suffering. The Age of Discovery revealed the Earth's vastness, yet it also revealed humanity's capacity for cruelty. As centuries turned, the frontier of discovery moved ever outward. The Arctic and Antarctic seas were charted. Australia's coastlines were mapped by Dutch and British explorers. In the Pacific, Polynesian navigators, who for millennia had read the stars and swells with unmatched mastery, became part of a world that at last acknowledged their genius. The world was meeting itself piece by piece, wave by wave. By the 17th century, global trade linked continents in an invisible web. Silver from the Andes flowed to China in exchange for silk and porcelain. Spices from the Moluccas flavored the tables of Amsterdam, and enslaved labor sustained the plantations of the Caribbean. Every voyage redrew the world map, not just in geography, but in destiny. The once isolated ecosystems of Earth were now one. Science, too, followed the winds of discovery. Navigational instruments like the astrolabe, sextant, and compass transformed from mystical tools into instruments of precision. The longitude problem, once the terror of sailors, would be solved through the invention of the marine chronometer in the 18th century, allowing ships to know not only where they were, but when they were. Exploration was evolving into science, and discovery into understanding. The Age of Discovery did not end with a single voyage or century. It faded slowly, transforming into the Enlightenment's curiosity and the Industrial Age's conquest. But its legacy endures. In the globalized world that followed, in the exchange of languages, foods, and ideas that now bind humanity. It was an age of courage and contradiction, of brilliance and brutality, faith and fire, greed and genius. And yet, at its heart, it was an age of mirrors, when the world, for the first time, saw itself. When an island in the Caribbean could influence the fate of Europe, when a storm in the Cape could change the course of empires, when a mapmaker's ink could turn myth into memory. As the last great sails faded from the oceans and steam replaced wind, the Earth no longer seemed infinite. The distances had been conquered, but not the mystery. For what the Age of Discovery truly uncovered was not merely continents, but connection, a realization that the world was one, fragile and vast, where every shore led to another, and every voyage was part of the same human story. Today, when satellites circle the globe and digital maps fit into the palms of our hands, the spirit of those early explorers still lingers, in curiosity, in wonder, in the endless desire to know what lies beyond the horizon. The Age of Discovery was never just about geography. It was about humanity's unending quest to find itself across the oceans of time. And as we look back across those centuries of courage and collision, we see not only the world they revealed, but the one they created, the world we now inherit, mapped by their peril, connected by their dreams. For when the world finally met itself, it changed forever. And so did we. The world had awakened. The seas that once divided humanity were now highways of ambition. But the meeting of worlds was still incomplete. Beyond the great Atlantic and Indian Oceans, vast regions awaited their own rediscovery, by those who would come and by those who had never left. As European powers planted their banners along coasts and islands, Africa became the first and most tragic stage of this expanding global web. For centuries before European arrival, Africa had been a continent of mighty kingdoms. Mali, Benin, Congo, Ethiopia, linked by their own networks of trade and culture. Gold from the Niger, ivory from the forests, and salt from the Sahara had flowed northward to the markets of the Mediterranean. But in the 15th century, the balance shifted. Portuguese caravels probing south along the Atlantic coast found not only trade but people. Millions of lives that would soon be drawn into a global system of bondage. At first, contact was cautious. Trade posts were built at Elmina and Luanda. Goods were exchanged: copper, cloth, beads, and guns for captives taken in regional wars. Yet the demand grew monstrous. Sugar plantations in Madeira and later in Brazil required endless labor. Thus began the Atlantic slave trade, the human current beneath the sails of empire. By the 1600s, ships carried chained men, women, and children across the Middle Passage, a voyage so brutal that countless lives were lost before reaching shore. In the Americas, African labor built the wealth of Europe, while African culture, in music, language, and spirit, endured and transformed the New World in return. The Age of Discovery had not merely connected continents, it had bound them in suffering and resilience alike. Meanwhile, the Indian Ocean, long a crossroads of civilizations, became the theater of maritime rivalry. For thousands of years, traders from Arabia, India, and East Africa had harnessed the monsoon winds to carry spices, textiles, and gold across the sea. The arrival of the Portuguese disrupted this balance. Armed with cannon and the cross, they stormed coastal cities. Kilwa, Mombasa, and Malindi fell to their guns. In 1510, they seized Goa, transforming it into the capital of their Eastern Empire. From there, fleets fanned out, to Ceylon for cinnamon, to Malacca for cloves, and to the Moluccas, the fabled Spice Islands. A chain of forts and missions stitched together a maritime empire that stretched from Lisbon to Nagasaki. But the Indian Ocean world was not easily subdued. Local powers resisted. The Sultanate of Aceh challenged Portuguese dominance in Southeast Asia. Ottoman fleets clashed with them in the Red Sea. By the late 16th century, the newcomers were no longer alone. The Dutch arrived, pragmatic and ruthless, with their East India Company, the VOC. Unlike monarchies, it was a corporation, driven not by faith, but by profit. Its flag bore not a cross, but letters, a symbol of commerce becoming empire. The Dutch seized Malacca from the Portuguese, established Batavia, modern Jakarta, and monopolized the spice trade. Nutmeg, once worth more than gold by weight, was controlled with precision and violence. Islands like Banda were emptied of their people, replaced by plantations. Yet, through these same channels of brutality, ideas and knowledge began to flow. Cartographers mapped, naturalists collected, and navigators charted the winds that connected half the planet. Farther north, the coasts of China and Japan revealed the limits of European ambition. The Ming Empire, immense and self-sufficient, saw the foreign ships as curiosities, visitors from distant barbarians. Trade was permitted only through select ports, like Macau, where the Portuguese were allowed a foothold. To the Chinese, these explorers were not discoverers, but latecomers to a world already connected by centuries of Asian exchange. In Japan, Jesuit missionaries such as Francis Xavier brought Christianity and Western science, finding both fascination and suspicion among the daimyos. For a time, faith and trade flourished together, but by the early 17th century, the Tokugawa shoguns turned inward, sealing Japan's ports to the world. While Europe expanded outward, Japan chose isolation, guarding its identity from the storms of empire. To the east of Asia stretched the largest ocean of all, the Pacific, an expanse that defied comprehension. Yet, long before Magellan or Cook, it had been home to one of the greatest navigational achievements in human history. Polynesian voyagers, guided by the stars, currents, and the flight of birds, had settled islands scattered across millions of square kilometers, from Hawaii to Aotearoa, from Samoa to Rapa Nui. Their canoes, not their compasses, mapped the Pacific's heart. When European explorers entered this realm, they were entering a world already known, not to their maps, but to its people. Spanish galleons sailing from Mexico to the Philippines discovered new routes. The Manila galleons, linking the silver mines of the New World with the markets of Asia. Across the Pacific, a circle of trade emerged, connecting Acapulco to Manila, Manila to Canton, and back to Seville. The world was no longer divided by ocean. It was unified by them. The 17th and 18th centuries turned exploration into science. The age of conquistadors gave way to the age of cartographers and natural philosophers. Navigation became an art of mathematics. The sextant replaced the astrolabe. The chronometer unlocked longitude. Ships no longer sailed blindly. They sailed with purpose, charting coastlines and measuring time itself. Among these new explorers were not only sailors, but thinkers. The Englishman James Cook, once a humble navigator, became a symbol of the scientific explorer. Between 1768 and 1779, his voyages aboard the Endeavour, Resolution, and Discovery mapped New Zealand, Australia's east coast, and the Pacific Islands with unprecedented precision. Cook observed the transit of Venus, collected specimens, and recorded languages. Yet his arrival also heralded the coming of empire. The same voyages that mapped the Pacific also opened it to colonization. In the Americas, the Spanish Empire, vast and glittering, began to crack under its own weight. The silver that had enriched Seville drained away in endless wars. Indigenous cultures, though crushed, endured, blending their heritage with the imposed faith of their conquerors. The Aztec and Inca civilizations had fallen, but the descendants of their people remained, weaving a new identity from the fragments of the old. The world, having met itself, was beginning to transform itself. As the 18th century unfolded, exploration took on a new dimension, that of understanding nature itself. Voyages were launched not only for gold or spice, but for knowledge. The expeditions of Bougainville, La Pérouse, and Humboldt carried scientists, artists, and botanists who catalogued the Earth's flora, fauna, and geography. Alexander von Humboldt's journeys through South America revealed the interconnectedness of ecosystems, a vision that would later inspire Darwin. And then came the final revelation that discovery was not endless. The last blank spaces on maps, the interiors of Africa, the poles, the high Himalayas, were gradually filled. The very notion of the unknown world began to vanish. The Earth was finite, its mysteries now subjects of study rather than rumor. What had begun as the quest for spice and salvation had become the dawn of global science. Yet beneath this triumph of knowledge lay the echoes of loss. Whole civilizations had been reshaped or erased. Languages disappeared. Ecosystems changed. The age of discovery had illuminated the planet, but it had also cast deep shadows. Still, out of those collisions came the modern world. Potatoes from Peru fed Europe. Coffee from Ethiopia shaped the mornings of Paris and London. Silver from Bolivia fueled trade with China. The map of the world had become a network, an intricate weave of commerce, culture, and exchange. In Africa, explorers like Mungo Park, Richard Burton, and David Livingstone ventured inland, driven by curiosity, faith, and imperial ambition. Their reports stirred Europe's imagination of vast lakes, mysterious rivers, and unseen peoples. Yet their discoveries also paved the way for colonial conquest, as European powers carved the continent into possessions. The Berlin Conference of 1884 formalized this scramble, the ultimate, tragic end of the Age of Discovery, when exploration became domination. By the late 19th century, there were no more blank spaces left. From pole to pole, from mountain to reef, the world had been mapped. The dream that had once driven caravels into the Atlantic had reached its end, and its beginning. Humanity, for the first time, could see itself as one species on one planet. And yet, discovery did not die. It changed form. The same curiosity that had driven Diaz and Magellan now turned inward, into the sciences, into the stars. The telescopes that probed the heavens were descendants of the same instruments that once guided ships. The cartographers who mapped the Earth became astronomers charting other worlds. The compass had pointed outward. Now, it pointed to infinity. In the quiet aftermath of centuries of exploration, philosophers and historians began to ask what it had all meant. The world had met itself, but what had it found? In the meeting of East and West, of conqueror and conquered, of slave and master, of faith and reason, humanity had revealed its brilliance and its blindness alike. Discovery had brought both enlightenment and exploitation, beauty and brutality intertwined. Still, through it all, something endured. The human desire to know, to see, to connect. Even amid empire and conquest, there were those who drew maps not for kings, but for knowledge, who wrote journals not for glory, but for truth. Their legacy is the truest treasure of the age of discovery, understanding. Today, we inherit their world, a planet connected by flight paths and fiber optics, where the oceans are crossed in hours, not months. Yet the echoes of those first voyages remain in every globe, every GPS coordinate, every name etched on the map. The Magellan Strait, the Cape of Good Hope, the Gulf of Guinea. These are not just places. They are memorials to human endurance, curiosity, and consequence. As we look upon our digital maps, perfect, complete, and glowing, we might forget that once these outlines were the dreams of sailors, that every coastline was once a question, every island a revelation, every horizon a leap of faith. The age of discovery was never truly about finding new lands. It was about finding the edges of our imagination, and then crossing them. In the stillness of history's ocean, we can almost hear the whisper of sails, the creak of timber, the rush of wind against canvas. We can see the stars mirrored in dark water, guiding the lost toward the known. And we can feel, deep within the current of time, the pulse of a species forever seeking, forever voyaging. For in that age, when the world finally met itself, humanity discovered both the planet and its own reflection. And that reflection still sails on.